May 20th, 1536, just 24 hours after Anne Boleyn's blood stained the scaffold at Tower Green, Henry VIII married his third wife. Jane Seymour was everything Anne Boleyn was not. Quiet, submissive, pale, and most importantly, she had learned from her predecessor's fatal mistakes. Jane understood the most important lesson in Tudor England. Queens existed for one purpose only: to produce male heirs. Everything else was secondary. And unlike Anne Boleyn, Jane would deliver exactly what Henry wanted most. But getting what you desire most can be the most dangerous thing of all, because Henry was about to learn that even his greatest triumph would come at a price that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If you think Henry's story gets happier from here, you're tragically wrong. Subscribe now, because we're about to witness how even Henry's moment of greatest joy becomes another chapter in his descent into madness. Jane Seymour had been watching Anne Boleyn's rise and fall with careful attention. As one of Anne's ladies-in-waiting, Jane had seen firsthand how a queen's behavior could determine whether she lived or died. And Jane was determined not to repeat Anne's mistakes. Where Anne had been outspoken, Jane was silent. Where Anne had chalenged Henry intellectually, Jane agreed with everything he said. Where Anne had demanded to be treated as an equal partner, Jane positioned herself as a humble servant grateful for any royal attention. Jane's family, the Seymours, had coached her carefully in how to handle the king. Her brothers Edward and Thomas understood that their sister's womb represented their family's path to ultimate power. If Jane could produce Henry's male heir, the Seymours would become the most influential family in England. The strategy worked perfectly. Henry, exhausted by Anne's intelligence and independence, found Jane's submissiveness refreshing. Here was a woman who wouldn't challenge him, wouldn't argue theology with bishops, wouldn't demand input on matters of state. Jane would simply do what Tudor queens were supposed to do: look beautiful, stay quiet, and produce sons. The contrast with Anne Boleyn couldn't have been more stark. Where Anne had been dark-haired and olive-skinned, Jane was fair and pale. Where Anne had been passionate and fiery, Jane was calm and controlled. Where Anne had been educated and well-read, Jane was almost illiterate, barely able to write her own name. Henry convinced himself that Jane's simplicity was a virtue. Perhaps his previous wives had been too complex, too intelligent, too ambitious. Perhaps God preferred humble women who knew their place. Jane Seymour seemed like the perfect answer to all of Henry's problems. The speed of Henry's courtship of Jane while Anne was still alive had shocked even his most cynical courtiers. But now that Anne was dead, Henry felt free to celebrate his new beginning openly. Jane represented hope, the hope that finally, after nearly 30 years of marriage troubles, Henry would get the son he desperately needed. Jane's first pregnancy was announced in early 1537. The entire kingdom held its breath. This pregnancy would determine not just Jane's fate, but the fate of the Tudor dynasty itself. If Jane delivered a son, she would be secure for life. If she failed like Catherine and Anne before her, well, Henry had already demonstrated what happened to queens who disappointed him. But Jane had advantages her predecessors lacked. She had seen what worked and what didn't. She had learned from the queen's worth of mistakes. And most importantly, she had the full support of her ambitious brothers, who were determined to see their family succeed. Where others had failed, Henry's behavior during Jane's pregnancy was markedly different from his treatment of his previous wives. With Catherine, he had been confident to the point of arrogance. With Anne, he had been passionate but increasingly frustrated. With Jane, he was almost superstitious in his careful attention to her needs. Every detail of Jane's daily routine was planned to maximize the chances of a successful pregnancy. Her diet was carefully controlled. Her activities were limited. Her chambers were kept at the perfect temperature. Henry even postponed military campaigns to stay close to court during the critical months. The pregnancy progressed without incident. Through the summer of 1537, Jane seemed healthy, content, and confident. Royal physicians issued regular bulletins assuring the kingdom that all was well. For the first time in years, Henry allowed himself to believe that God was finally smiling upon his reign. September 1537, as Jane's pregnancy entered its final month, preparations for the birth reached fever pitch. The royal nursery was prepared for a prince. Proclamations announcing the birth of a male heir were printed and ready for distribution. Celebratory tournaments were planned. England was ready to welcome its future king. October 9th, 1537. Jane went into labor at Hampton Court Palace. Henry paced nervously in his chambers while the kingdom's most experienced midwives attended to his queen. This birth would determine everything: the future of the Tudor dynasty, the security of the succession, Henry's own sense of divine favor. The labor was difficult and prolonged. Jane struggled for 3 days and nights while Henry grew increasingly anxious. Rumors spread through the court that something was wrong. Some whispered that God was punishing Henry yet again. Others suggested that Jane might share the same cursed fate as her predecessors. But on October 12, 1537, at 2 in the morning, Jane Seymour delivered a healthy baby boy. The child was named Edward, after Henry's grandfather, Edward IV. After 28 years of marriage and countless disappointments, Henry finally had his legitimate male heir. Henry's joy was overwhelming and immediate. He wept openly when he held his son for the first time. The infant prince was everything Henry had dreamed of: healthy, strong, and most importantly, male. The Tudor dynasty was secure. The succession was settled. Henry's break from Rome had been vindicated by God's blessing of a son. The celebrations that followed Edward's birth were the most magnificent England had ever seen. Church bells rang across the kingdom. Bonfires blazed in every village. Free wine flowed in London streets. Henry declared a general amnesty for prisoners and distributed lavish gifts to courtiers and commoners alike. For the first time in decades, Henry seemed genuinely happy. The paranoia that had marked his later years appeared to lift. The violent mood swings became less frequent. The man who had executed 2 wives and countless courtiers suddenly seemed almost benevolent in his joy. At finally achieving his heart's desire, Jane's triumph seemed complete. She had accomplished what neither Catherine of Aragon nor Anne Boleyn had managed. She had given Henry the son that secured both her own position and her family's future. The Seymours were now the most powerful family in England after the royal family itself. But even in this moment of supreme triumph, there were warning signs that Jane's victory might prove temporary. The difficult birth had taken a severe toll on her body. Royal physicians noted that she was recovering more slowly than expected. She seemed weak, pale, and listless in the days following Edward's arrival. Henry was too overjoyed to pay proper attention to his wife's condition. He was consumed with plans for his son's future. The christening ceremony, the selection of tutors, the establishment of the prince's household. Edward's arrival had given Henry a new purpose in life, and Jane's health seemed like a secondary concern. October 15th, 1537. 3 days after giving birth, Jane's condition suddenly worsened. She developed a high fever and complained of severe abdominal pain. The royal physicians were baffled. Difficult births were common, but Jane had seemed to be recovering normally. Modern medical knowledge suggests that Jane was probably suffering from puerperal sepsis, a bacterial infection that commonly killed new mothers in the 16th century. But Tudor medicine had no understanding of bacterial infections. The physicians tried their usual remedies: bloodletting, herbal concoctions, prayers, and useless poultices. Henry finally began to realize that something was seriously wrong. The woman who had given him his greatest joy was now fighting for her life. After so many years of disappointment, the possibility that his moment of triumph might be destroyed by tragedy was almost unbearable. Jane's condition continued to deteriorate over the next several days. She drifted in and out of consciousness. When she was lucid, she spoke constantly about baby Edward, worrying about his care and his future. She seemed to understand that she might not live to raise the son. She had sacrificed her health to deliver. October 24th, 1537. Just 12 days after giving birth to the future Edward VI, Jane Seymour died at Hampton Court Palace. She was only 28 years old. The queen who had finally given Henry his heart's desire had paid for that gift with her life. Henry's reaction to Jane's death was unlike his response to any previous loss. When Catherine of Aragon died, he had celebrated. When Anne Boleyn was executed, He had remarried the next day, but Jane's death genuinely devastated him. For the first time in his adult life, Henry experienced grief without anger. Jane had done everything right. She had been obedient, submissive, and most crucially, she had delivered the male heir that secured Henry's dynasty. Her death couldn't be blamed on disobedience or divine punishment. It was simply tragic. Henry ordered that Jane be given the most magnificent funeral England had ever seen for a queen. She was buried at Windsor Castle in St. George's Chapel, and Henry declared that when his own time came, he would be buried beside her. Of all his wives, Jane alone would share his final resting place. The king, who had callously discarded to previous wives, now seemed broken by the loss of the third. Henry retreated from public life for weeks, appearing only when royal duties absolutely demanded his presence. Courtiers noted that he aged visibly in the months following Jane's death, as if her loss had reminded him of his own mortality. But Jane's death created a new problem for Henry. Edward was now the heir to the throne, but he was just an infant. If Henry died while Edward was still a child, England would face a regency with all the political instability that such arrangements typically brought. Henry needed to marry again, both to provide companionship for himself and additional heirs to secure the succession. Yet Henry found himself reluctant to seek a fourth wife. Jane had proven that it was possible for a queen to satisfy his demands completely. Any future wife would inevitably be compared to Jane's perfect record of obedience and fertility. How could any woman hope to measure up to the memory of the queen who had died giving Henry his greatest gift? The contrast between Henry's treatment of Jane and his previous wives revealed the evolution of his character. With Catherine, he had been young and relatively inexperienced in the art of manipulating women. With Anne, he had been passionate, but ultimately frustrated by her independence. With Jane, he had been calculated and controlling, applying lessons learned from his previous marriages. Jane's success in giving Henry a son validated his belief that queens existed solely to serve royal convenience. Her submissiveness proved that wives who knew their place could avoid the fates that befell Catherine and Anne. Her death tragically demonstrated that even perfect obedience couldn't guarantee safety in Henry's England. Edward's birth had given Henry the male heir he had craved for nearly 3 decades. But the price of that achievement was the life of the only wife Henry ever seemed to genuinely love. Jane Seymour had won the game that killed Anne Boleyn, only to discover that even winners could lose everything in Henry's court. Henry was now a widower with 3 children. Mary, his daughter with Catherine, was 21 and still considered illegitimate despite being restored to the succession. Elizabeth, his daughter with Anne, was just 4 years old and lived under the constant shadow of her mother's execution. And Edward, his precious son with Jane, was an infant whose survival was never guaranteed in an age of high child mortality. The king who had torn England from Rome to secure his dynasty now found himself alone with his achievements. He had his male heir, his break from papal authority, and his absolute control over the English church. But the cost of these victories was becoming increasingly clear. Dead wives, estranged daughters, political isolation from Catholic Europe, and a growing reputation for tyranny that made foreign alliances nearly impossible. Jane Seymour's brief reign as queen had lasted just over a year, but in that short time, she had accomplished more than any other Tudor queen. She had given Henry his son, secured the succession, and earned a place in the king's heart that no other woman would ever claim. Her death marked the end of Henry's capacity for genuine love. The wives who followed Jane would be political arrangements, desperate attempts to secure additional heirs, or simply the products of an aging king's inability to control his appetites. None would be mourned as Jane was mourned. Next time, we'll witness Henry's disastrous 4th marriage, and of Cleves will discover that being chosen as Henry's wife is an honor that no intelligent woman would want, and we'll see how Henry's increasing paranoia and physical deterioration begin to transform him into the grotesque tyrant who would terrorize England for the remainder of his reign.